Welcome back to the Drowsy Historian. Take a moment before we begin to settle yourself. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Find a posture that feels comfortable. Let your shoulders fall away from your ears. Soften your jaw. Let the day go. Tonight we are going to travel slowly through the first 1100 years of Imperial Chinese history. From the unification of China by the first emperor in 221 before the birth of Christ, through the long and patient work of the Han dynasty, through the centuries of disunion that followed it, through the brief brilliance of the Sui, and into the long golden afternoon of the Tang. It is, in scale, a story comparable to the long collapse of Rome we followed in another evening's broadcast. It is also, in many ways, a story of the opposite shape, where the Roman world rose, slowly, to its peak, and then declined, slowly, to its end. The Chinese world rose, declined, fragmented, reunified, fragmented again, reunified again, in a long rhythm of cycles that, in some real sense, has continued without interruption to this very night. This is one of the great historical facts about China. It has, for over 2,000 years, been the same political project. The territories have shifted. The dynasties have changed. The capitals have moved. The script has been simplified. The language has evolved. But the basic civilizational entity, a literate, bureaucratic, agrarian society organized around a centralized state with claims to universal sovereignty, has, with brief interruptions, persisted. The China of tonight is the direct linear descendant of the China that the first emperor unified in his late 30s, more than 2,200 years ago. There is no urgency to any of this. The Chinese civilization, in its most characteristic moments, has rarely been in a hurry. Decisions were made over decades. Dynasties planned over centuries. Buildings were built over generations. So you also do not need to hurry. You can let the names drift past. You can let the dates blur. You can fall asleep at any moment. The story will keep going, just as the cycles kept going, with or without anyone watching. It is the year 210 before the birth of Christ. The country is what we now call China, although the people who live there do not yet use that name for themselves. They call their country Zhongguo, the Middle Kingdom, or Tianxia, all under heaven. They have been, until very recently, a patchwork of competing states. 7 major kingdoms locked in a cycle of warfare so prolonged and so consuming that the period itself has come to be called, by their later historians, the Warring States. The Warring States period lasted, by the conventional reckoning, about 2.5 centuries, from the early 5th century before Christ until very nearly this very year. It ended in 22 before 21, when the king of one of those 7 states, the Western Kingdom of Qin, ruled by a young man of about 38 years of age named Ying Zheng, completed the systematic conquest of all the others. The conquest had taken him about 10 years. It had been planned, militarily and administratively, for nearly a century. It was the work of a state that had, more thoroughly than any of its rivals, embraced a particular school of political philosophy, the legalist school, founded by men named Shang Yang and Han Feizi, that emphasized strict laws, harsh punishments, the systematic mobilization of the entire population for state service, and the absolute primacy of the ruler. The Qin had not just outfought their rivals, they had, more importantly, out-organized them. When the conquest was complete, in 221, Ying Zheng took a new title. The old title for a Chinese ruler had been Wang, meaning king, and there had been throughout the Warring States period, many kings simultaneously. Ying Zheng, having defeated all of them, decided that king was now insufficient. He combined 2 older words, Huang, meaning august or radiant, and Di, meaning emperor or godlike sovereign, to coin a new title that had never been used for a human ruler before. Huangdi, Emperor. He was the first of his line to bear this title, and he expected, in his ambition, that his line would last forever. He proclaimed himself Shi Huangdi, the first emperor. Tonight we are at his deathbed, or rather, on the road home from his deathbed. The first emperor died in the late summer of 210 before Christ, while on an inspection tour of the eastern provinces of his new empire. He was about 50 years old. He had ruled in some form since he was 13, the first 11 years as king of Qin, the last 12 as the first emperor of unified China. He had, in those years, been one of the most consequential individuals in human history. He had standardized the writing system across his empire, replacing the regional scripts of the former warring states with a single unified version that, although later modified, is still recognizably the script in use in China today. He had standardized the legal code. He had standardized the weights, the measures, the coinage. He had standardized, and this is, in some ways, the most poetic of his standardizations, the gauge of cart axles, so that wagons could move smoothly on roads anywhere in his empire. He had built, by mobilizing hundreds of thousands of conscripts, the first version of what would later become the Great Wall, connecting and extending the existing fortifications of the former northern warring states into a unified frontier system designed to keep out the steppe nomads. He had built in his capital at Xianyang an enormous palace complex that would, after his death, be burned to the ground by a conquering army. He had built, also, his own enormous tomb, a vast underground complex, set into the foothills of Mount Lai, designed as a complete miniature replica of his cosmos, with rivers of mercury, ceiling stars made of pearls, and an army of, by the most recent estimates, over 8,000 life-sized terracotta soldiers, each individually sculpted, arranged in battle formation to guard the dead emperor's eternal court. The tomb mound itself, where the actual emperor was buried, has not been excavated. Modern Chinese archaeologists, despite extensive non-invasive imaging, have left it sealed, partly out of respect, partly because the surrounding archaeology continues to surprise them, and partly because the ancient texts describe the tomb chamber as containing the rivers of liquid mercury, which would make excavation acutely dangerous. Tests of the surrounding soil have, in fact, revealed elevated mercury levels, suggesting that whatever the ancient sources reported about the tomb's interior may have been substantially correct. The first emperor's actual remains, 2,235 years after his death, lie undisturbed under a hill the size of a small mountain in the Wei River Valley. The terracotta army, however, the strange silent battalions of clay men positioned to defend the tomb from underground enemies, was discovered, almost by accident in 1974, by a local farmer digging a well. The figures, the world subsequently realized, are individual, different faces, different uniforms, different ranks, different ethnic features, reflecting the various peoples who had been recruited into the Qin armies. They are, in their patient silence, one of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. The first emperor died on the road, far from his capital. His chief minister, a man named Li Si, and the chief eunuch, a man named Zhao Gao, decided to keep the death secret until they could return to Xianyang and arrange the succession according to their own preferences. They placed the emperor's body in his closed sedan chair. They had food brought to the chair at mealtimes. They issued orders, in his name, throughout the slow journey home. They had, however, a single problem. The emperor had been dead for several weeks. In the late summer heat of central China, the smell, very rapidly, became unmanageable. Their solution was to load several carts with rotting fish, which they had follow the imperial procession at close range, in the official explanation that the emperor was indulging an unexpected craving for salted seafood. The smell of the fish disguised the smell of the emperor. The procession, in this strange way, completed its journey home, possibly the most macabre cortege in human history, without arousing suspicion. When they reached the capital, they announced the death, and produced a forged will, appointing the first emperor's youngest and most pliant son, Hu Hai, as the second emperor. The first emperor's intended heir, an older son named Fusu, who had been overseeing frontier construction on the northern wall, was sent a forged order to commit suicide. Fusu, a dutiful son to a father he barely knew, complied. Hu Hai, who was about 20 years old at his accession, ruled for 3 years before being driven to suicide by Zhao Gao, who then briefly attempted to install a third puppet ruler, a grandson, before himself being killed in a palace coup. The Qin dynasty, which the first emperor had expected to last for 10,000 generations, lasted, in functional form, only 4 years after his death. By 206 before Christ, the empire he had unified had collapsed into civil war. The Qin capital was sacked. The dynasty was finished. The first emperor's terracotta army was buried under a layer of charred timbers, the rebels having burned the wooden ceiling of the tomb pit before sealing the chamber. The army was forgotten for the next 21 centuries. But the unification itself, despite the collapse of its founding dynasty, did not undo. The political fact of a single Chinese empire, ruled from a single capital, governing a single literate population in a single standardized script, had been established. It would persist. The next dynasty to rise would inherit the unified empire, would refine its administration, and would extend it in time and space far beyond what the first emperor had imagined. That dynasty was the Han. The Han dynasty was founded by a former minor official, a man of peasant origin, named Liu Bang, who had risen to prominence as a rebel commander during the chaos that followed the first emperor's death. Liu Bang was, by every contemporary account, an unimpressive man in personal terms. He was, in the early years of his career, illiterate. He drank heavily. He had a famously vulgar manner of speaking. He once, during a political conference, urinated into the formal hat of a visiting Confucian scholar to express his contempt for the scholar's pedantic advice. He was, in his own assessment, lucky rather than talented. He won, he said, because his enemies were even less competent than he was. But he had, throughout his rise, an unusual ability to attract and retain skilled subordinates. His 3 principal companions, the strategist, Zhang Liang, the administrator Xiao He, and the general Han Xin, would, between them, do much of the actual work of consolidating his power. Liu Bang himself acted as the political center of the operation. He had, despite his coarseness, an intuitive grasp of when to be generous, when to be ruthless, and when to delegate. He would later observe, in one of the famous reflective moments of his life, that he had been able to use these 3 men, while his great rival Xiang Yu had been unable to use even the one talented advisor that Xiang Yu possessed. That, Liu Bang said, was why he had won. He defeated Xiang Yu, in 202 before Christ, in the final battle of a long civil war. He proclaimed himself emperor of a new dynasty that he named after his old fief, the small territory of Han. He established his capital at a place called Chang'an, the Long Peace, in the Wei River Valley, very near the old Qin capital. He ruled for 7 more years, dying in 195 before Christ of an arrow wound that had not properly healed. The dynasty he founded would last, in 2 halves separated by a brief interruption, for over 400 years. From 202 before Christ to 9 after Christ, the Western Han ruled from Chang'an. From 25 to 220 after Christ, after a brief interregnum under the usurper Wang Mang, the Eastern Han ruled from a new capital at Luoyang. The Han would, over those 4 centuries, define what it meant to be Chinese in ways that have, in some essential respects, not changed since. The dominant ethnic group in modern China still calls itself the Han. The dominant Chinese language is still called the Han language. The classical Chinese literary tradition is, in its most foundational sense, the tradition that crystallized during the Han dynasty. The most consequential of the Han emperors, by some margin, was the 7th. His name was Liu Che. He took the throne in 141 before Christ, at the age of 15, and ruled for 54 years, dying in 87 before Christ. Posthumously, he was given the temple name Wu, the martial emperor, and it is by that name that he is generally remembered. Wu Di was, by every account, a complicated and ambitious man. He centralized imperial power at the expense of the regional lords. He systematized the imperial bureaucracy. He patronized Confucian scholars, ordering the establishment of an imperial academy, where the Confucian classics, the core texts of what would become Chinese moral and political philosophy for the next 2,000 years, were to be studied and transmitted. The civil service examinations that, much later, would become the principal method of recruiting Chinese government officials, derive in their conceptual ancestry from this Han Confucian establishment. Wu Di also expanded the empire enormously. He pushed Chinese armies west, into Central Asia, where they made first contact with the Greco-Bactrian and Parthian successor states of Alexander's empire. He pushed south, into what is now northern Vietnam, which would remain under Chinese rule for the next 1,000 years. He pushed north, into Korea, establishing 4 military commanderies that would define Korean political life for centuries afterward. The most consequential of Wu Di's expansions was westward, against the steppe confederation of the Xiongnu, the great horse nomad people who had been raiding northern China for over a century. The Han-Xiongnu Wars, which lasted in various forms throughout Wu Di's reign, were the first sustained large-scale conflict between an agrarian Chinese empire and a steppe pastoralist confederation. They produced, by their direct and indirect consequences, the first regular trade relations between China and the lands to the west of the Pamirs. The diplomat who established those relations was a man named Zhang Qian, whom Wu Di had originally sent west, in 138 before Christ, to seek an alliance with the Yuezhi people, ancient enemies of the Xiongnu, who had been driven westward into Bactria. Zhang Qian was captured by the Xiongnu en route, and held for 10 years. He escaped, completed his mission, was captured again on his way home, escaped again, and finally returned to Chang'an in 126 before Christ, having been gone for 13 years. The Yuezhi alliance had not materialized. The Yuezhi, by then settled in Bactria, were no longer interested in revenge on the Xiongnu. But Zhang Qian had brought back the first reliable Chinese description of the lands west of the Pamirs. He described, to a fascinated imperial court, settled cities in Central Asia, the kingdoms of Parthia and Bactria, the existence of a great agricultural civilization in northwestern India, and rumors of a yet more distant power called Dakin, most likely by modern interpretation, the Roman Empire. Wu Di sent further missions. Trade caravans began to move regularly, by the late 2nd century before Christ, between Chang'an and the cities of Central Asia, then onward to Persia, then onward to Roman Syria. The route is now called by historians since the late 19th century, the Silk Road. It would remain for the next 1400 years, the principal overland connection between the great civilizations of East and West Eurasia. The Roman emperors of late antiquity, who wore Chinese silk in their imperial robes, did not generally know that the silk had come from China. The Chinese emperors who imported Roman glassware did not generally know it had come from Rome. But the trade flowed in both directions, regardless. The later Western Han period saw a slow accumulation of administrative problems. The empire had grown too large to be governed effectively from the center. The great families of the Han nobility had accumulated, over generations, vast tax-exempt landed estates, which gradually undermined the imperial treasury. The court became, throughout the 1st century before Christ, increasingly dominated by powerful consort families, the relatives of empresses, who used their connection to the throne to install their own sons in positions of authority. The emperors themselves, as the dynasty aged, became increasingly nominal figures, manipulated by relatives and eunuchs in shifting court factions. In 9 after Christ, a particularly capable consort relative named Wang Mang formally seized the throne, declaring the Han dynasty over and proclaiming his own dynasty, which he called Jin, the New. Wang Mang was by every account an idealistic Confucian reformer. He attempted, in his 15-year reign, to reverse the long accumulation of land in the hands of the aristocracy by nationalizing all land and redistributing it. He attempted to abolish slavery, he standardized currency, he reorganized the bureaucracy, according to a particular reading of the ancient Zhou dynasty's institutional structures. The reforms, although intellectually serious, did not work. The aristocracy resisted them. The bureaucracy could not implement them at the speed Wang Mang demanded. A series of catastrophic Yellow River floods, around 20 after Christ, displaced millions of peasants, and produced large bands of desperate refugees. The refugees, organized into religiously inflected rebel armies, most famously the Red Eyebrows, who painted their eyebrows red as an identifying mark, eventually overwhelmed Wang Mang's government. The capital fell in 23. Wang Mang himself was killed during the looting of his palace by a soldier who later removed his head and sent it to the rebel commander. The head was preserved in a vault for years and reportedly inspected, on solemn occasions, as a warning against ambitious reform. The Han dynasty was restored, 2 years later, by a distant member of the Han royal family named Liu Xiu, who reunified the country and re-established the imperial system. He moved the capital from Chang'an, which had been heavily damaged in the recent fighting, to a more easterly city called Luoyang. The new dynasty is called, by historians, the Eastern Han, to distinguish it from the earlier Western Han. The Eastern Han would last another 200 years. It would produce its own distinguished emperors, especially in its 1st century. It would expand and refine the imperial bureaucracy. It would patronize, in its early decades, the spread of a new religious movement that had begun to arrive in China overland from the West. Buddhism, which had originated in northern India about 500 years before, and which had been transmitted along the Silk Road by missionary monks who arrived in Luoyang as early as the 1st century after Christ. The Eastern Han is the dynasty under which Buddhism first established a permanent presence in Chinese civilization. But the Eastern Han also struggled, throughout its later century, with the same problems that had brought down the Western Han: eunuch court corruption, consort family domination, peasant displacement, regional warlordism. By the late 2nd century, central authority was eroding. In 184 after Christ, a religiously inflected peasant rebellion called the Yellow Turbans broke out in the eastern provinces. The rebellion was eventually suppressed, but the suppression required the granting of substantial military authority to provincial governors, who used it to consolidate independent power bases. The dynasty, formerly still in existence, became increasingly unable to control its own provinces. The Eastern Han ended by the most common reckoning in 220 after Christ, when the last Han emperor was politely deposed by the son of one of the powerful provincial warlords. The empire that the first emperor had unified 441 years earlier was finally broken. What followed for nearly 4 centuries was a long period of fragmentation that the Chinese themselves later called the Northern and Southern dynasties, or simply the Long Disunion. It began with the famous Three Kingdoms period between 220 and 280 after Christ, the era of warfare among the 3 successor states of Wei in the north, Shu in the southwest, and Wu in the southeast. The Three Kingdoms is, in some ways, the best-known period of Chinese history outside China itself, because it became, much later, the setting for the great 14th-century historical novel The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which has been read, adapted, dramatized, and reinterpreted by every subsequent generation of Chinese literate culture, and which is now, in various translated forms, also widely read in Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and the broader Sinitic cultural sphere. The Three Kingdoms period, despite its great literary fame, was militarily indecisive. None of the Three Kingdoms succeeded in conquering the other 2. Eventually, in 265, a powerful general within the Wei Kingdom, Sima Yan, deposed the Wei Emperor and proclaimed his own dynasty, which he called Jin. The Jin dynasty, after a series of campaigns, finally completed the conquest of the Three Kingdoms in 280, briefly reunifying China for the first time in 60 years. The reunification, however, did not last. The Jin dynasty almost immediately fell into internal civil war among the imperial princes, the so-called War of the Eight Princes, between 301 and 306 after Christ, which destroyed most of the imperial central army and exhausted the treasury. Onto this weakened state in 304, a confederation of nomadic peoples from the northern frontier, Xiongnu remnants, Xianbei, Di, Cheng, and Ji, collectively remembered as the 5 barbarians, began to invade the Jin territories. By 316, the Jin capital at Luoyang had fallen. The dynasty had been driven south of the Yangtze, and the entire northern half of China had been overrun by a series of barbarian successor kingdoms, the so-called 16 Kingdoms, that would dominate the north for the next 270 years. The southern half of China in the same period remained under Chinese dynastic rule, although the dynasties changed several times. 6 successive dynasties, Eastern Jin, Liu Song, Southern Qi, Liang, Chen, ruled from a southern capital at Jiangkang, which is the modern city of Nanjing. The southern dynasties preserved the traditional forms of Chinese court culture, the Confucian classics, the literary practices of the Han period, and produced, in their patronage of poetry, painting, and Buddhist scholarship, some of the most refined artistic culture in Chinese history. In the north, meanwhile, the various barbarian dynasties slowly Sinicized. They adopted Chinese administration. They patronized Chinese scholars. They, increasingly, converted to Buddhism, which became, in the 4th and 5th centuries, the dominant religion of northern China. The most successful of the northern dynasties, the Northern Wei, was founded by the Chuoba clan of the Xianbei people in 386. The Northern Wei would rule most of northern China for over a century. Under the Emperor Shaowen, in the late 5th century, the Northern Wei court formally Sinicized, abandoning traditional Xianbei tribal customs, adopting Chinese family names, requiring the use of Chinese language at court, even prohibiting traditional Xianbei dress at imperial functions. The conquering nomads, in classic fashion, were absorbed into the Chinese cultural system that they had militarily defeated. The Long Disunion lasted, by the conventional reckoning, until 589 after Christ. In that year, a general named Yang Jian, who had risen to power within the northern Wei successor state of northern Zhou, finally completed the reunification of China under a single new dynasty. He called it the Sui. The Sui dynasty was, in some ways, the most consequential short-lived dynasty in Chinese history. It lasted, in functional form, only about 38 years, from 581 to 618 after Christ. But in those 38 years it accomplished the long political work of reunification that no previous attempted reunification of China had managed to make permanent. The Sui's two emperors, Yang Jian, posthumously called Wendi the Cultured Emperor, and his son Yang Guang, posthumously called Yang Di the Effulgent Emperor, were, in their personalities and their reigns, almost opposite figures. Wendi was, by every account, austere, frugal, deeply Buddhist in his religious practice, and obsessively focused on administrative consolidation. He standardized the legal code across the reunified empire. He established a centralized civil service examination system, the Keiju, the institution that, under later dynasties, would become the principal mechanism by which Chinese government officials were recruited, and which would shape Chinese intellectual culture for the next 1300 years. He carefully redistributed agricultural land according to the equal field system, which sought to prevent the renewed accumulation of estates by the great families. He kept his armies disciplined and his treasury full. His son Yang Di was, by contrast, a man of enormous ambition and almost no restraint. He moved the imperial capital from Chang'an to a newly built city called Luoyang. He commissioned the construction of an enormous canal, the Grand Canal, connecting the Yellow River system in the north with the Yangtze River system in the south, and ultimately reaching as far as Hangzhou Bay. The Grand Canal was, by some measures, the largest civil engineering project undertaken anywhere in the world before the modern industrial age. It is over 1,000 miles long. It required the labor of millions of conscripted peasants. It is, parts of it, still in use today. Yang Di also undertook a series of catastrophic military campaigns against the Kingdom of Goguryeo in northeastern Korea. He sent, in succession, 3 enormous armies, perhaps over 1 million soldiers cumulatively, north into Korea between 612 and 614. All 3 campaigns failed. The Goguryeo, with cleverer tactics and better local knowledge, defeated each invading force in turn. The casualties on the Sui side were enormous. The financial costs were ruinous. The discontent in the conscripted peasant population was building toward open revolt. By 618, Yang Di's empire was unraveling. Multiple regional rebellions had broken out. The general assigned to suppress one of those rebellions, a certain Li Yuan, military governor of the strategically critical Taiyuan region, instead joined the rebellion himself, marched on Chang'an, captured it in late 617, and proclaimed his own dynasty in mid-618. Yang Di himself, attempting to hold out in his southern capital at Jiangdu, was assassinated by his own bodyguard a few months later. He was strangled with a silk scarf by his own attendants in his bath. The Sui dynasty, after 38 years of accomplishment and overreach, was over. But what the Sui had built, the reunified empire, the centralized bureaucracy, the examination system, the Grand Canal, the standardized legal code, was not undone. It was, instead, inherited by the dynasty Li Yuan had just founded. That dynasty, which would carry forward and refine almost everything the Sui had begun, was the Tang. The Tang dynasty was founded by Li Yuan in 618, but it was made by his second son. Li Yuan himself, posthumously known as Gaozu, the High Ancestor, was a competent rather than brilliant ruler. He had 3 sons. The eldest, the heir apparent, was named Li Jiancheng. The second son was named Li Shimin. The third son was named Li Yuanji. Of the 3, the second son, Li Shimin, was by every account by far the most talented. He had been the principal military commander during the rebellion that brought his father to the throne. He had, in his early 20s, planned and executed the campaigns that had eliminated the most dangerous rival warlords. He had, in many respects, deserved the throne more than his elder brother, and both he and his elder brother knew it. The succession crisis, when it came, was settled in the manner that Chinese succession crises so often were. On the morning of the 2nd of July 626, Li Shimin and a small group of his loyal officers ambushed his 2 brothers, the elder brother Li Jiancheng and the younger brother Li Yuanji, who had allied with their elder brother against him, at the Xuanwu Gate of the Imperial Palace in Chang'an. Li Shimin shot Li Jiancheng in the chest with an arrow, killing him instantly. Li Yuanji was struck down by Li Shimin's officers a few moments later. The bodies were paraded back into the palace. Their wives and children, by various accounts, were killed shortly after. Li Yuan, who had been preparing to receive a normal court audience that morning, was informed by his second son's officers of what had happened. He understood perfectly what was being asked of him. He named Li Shimin the new crown prince that afternoon. 2 months later, he formally abdicated. Li Shimin took the throne in early September. He was 28 years old. He would be one of the greatest emperors in Chinese history. Li Shimin ruled for 23 years, from 626 to 649. Posthumously, he was given the temple name Taizong, the Grand Ancestor. He is, in the Chinese imperial pantheon, the model of what a competent emperor was supposed to be. He surrounded himself with talented advisors. He listened to criticism. He formally invited, and is supposed to have welcomed, frank remonstrance from his ministers, even when the remonstrance was uncomfortable. The most famous of his advisors, a Confucian scholar named Wei Zheng, was so blunt with the emperor that, on Wei Zheng's death in 643, the emperor wept and said, "I have lost a mirror." Taizong reformed the legal code. He systematized the equal field land redistribution that the Sui had begun. He extended and refined the civil service examination system. He patronized the great Buddhist translator Xuanzang, who returned in the late 640s from a 16-year pilgrimage to India, bringing hundreds of Sanskrit Buddhist texts that he and his disciples would spend the rest of their lives translating into Chinese, in a project that, more than any other single intellectual endeavor of the medieval world, established the deep textual foundation of East Asian Buddhism. Taizong also expanded the empire militarily. He defeated, decisively, the Eastern Turkic Khaganate that had dominated the steppe to the north of China. He extended Chinese protectorates along the Silk Road into the Tarim Basin. He defeated, after long campaigns, the southern kingdom of Tibet to the empire's southwest. By the time of his death, the Tang Empire was, by territorial extent and political reach, comparable to the Han at its peak. The capital city he ruled from, Chang'an, the same site as the old Han capital, although vastly rebuilt and expanded, was, in the 7th and 8th centuries, the largest and most cosmopolitan city in the world. At its peak, perhaps 1 million people lived in Chang'an. The city was laid out as a vast rectangular grid, 10 kilometers east to west, and 9 kilometers north to south, divided into 108 walled neighborhoods, each one a small city in its own right. The streets were broad. The main north-south avenue was wide enough to accommodate 55 horsemen riding abreast. The imperial palace, in the northern third of the city, was an enormous walled complex of audience halls, gardens, lakes, and offices. The population of Chang'an, in this great Tang century, was extraordinarily diverse. There were Persian merchants in their own quarter, with Zoroastrian fire temples. There were Sogdian traders from Central Asia, with Manichaean meeting houses. There were Korean and Japanese students in the foreign student quarter. Japan, in particular, was sending so many young aristocrats to Chang'an to study Chinese government and Buddhist scholarship that the entire structure of medieval Japanese government, the Japanese writing system, and Japanese Buddhism was, in this period, being constructed as a deliberate copy of Tang Chinese institutions. There were Indian Buddhist monks. There were Nestorian Christians with their own monastery. The famous Nestorian stele, erected in 781 and rediscovered in 1625, records the activities of this Christian community in Chang'an. There were Jewish merchants. There were Arab traders. It was, in the 7th and 8th centuries, simply the most cosmopolitan place on earth. Tang poets, and we will say more about them shortly, wrote in their verses about wine drunk in Persian taverns, served by foreign women dancing on tabletops, with Sogdian musicians playing strange instruments. The imagery is real. The sights, sounds, smells, and tastes of Chang'an in 750 after Christ were, in their cosmopolitan complexity, unmatched anywhere else in the world. Taizong died in 649 of natural causes at the age of 50. His third son, Li Ji, succeeded him as the new emperor, posthumously called Gaozong. Gaozong was, in his own right, a competent ruler, but he was also of weak health, prone to severe headaches, and increasingly unable to manage the demanding daily business of government. By the late 650s, the actual administration of the Tang Empire was being carried out, more and more, by Gaozong's empress. Her name was Wu Zetian. She had originally been a low-ranking concubine of the previous emperor Taizong. She had, after Taizong's death, been sent to a Buddhist convent according to imperial custom. The new emperor, Gaozong, had visited her there, had become infatuated, and had brought her back to the palace. She had risen rapidly through the rankings of imperial consorts. By 655, she had been formally elevated to empress, replacing Gaozong's previous wife, who was deposed amid accusations of witchcraft, and was ultimately strangled in her quarters along with her supporting concubine. After Gaozong's death in 683, Wu Zetian governed as regent for two of her sons in succession, both of whom she found unsatisfactory and replaced. In 690, she finally took the formal step of declaring the Tang dynasty itself temporarily ended, and proclaiming her own dynasty, which she called Zhou. She declared herself emperor, using deliberately the male title Huangdi, rather than the empress's title Huanghou. She is the only woman in the entirety of Chinese history to have formally taken the imperial title and ruled in her own right. Several women, before and after her, ruled as regents or as effectively dominant empresses, but only Wu Zetian formally became emperor. Her reign, which lasted until 705, was, in its administration, generally effective. She purged her enemies ruthlessly. She established a network of secret police informants. She executed several distinguished generals and many minor officials on probably fabricated charges. She also, however, expanded the civil service examinations, opened the bureaucracy to talented commoners from outside the established aristocratic families, and patronized Buddhism on a vast scale, building enormous Buddhist statues at Longmen, near her capital at Luoyang, and personally overseeing the translation of new sutras. The Tang's civil bureaucracy under her reign became in some ways more meritocratic than it had been before. She was eventually deposed, in 705, in a palace coup organized by senior officials who were uncomfortable with the prospect of one of her grandsons inheriting the imperial title under the Wu rather than Li family name. She was 80 years old. She abdicated peacefully. Her son Li Xian, who had briefly been emperor before her ascension and was now restored, formally renamed the dynasty back to Tang. Wu Zetian herself died a few months later, in late 705, in a small palace where she had been allowed to retire. She is buried, by her own request, with her husband Gaozong, in a tomb at Qianling west of Chang'an. The tomb has not been excavated. It is one of only 2 completely intact Tang imperial tombs. After Wu Zetian's deposition, the Tang dynasty went through a brief period of further succession instability, before settling, in 712, on a stable new emperor. He was Li Longji, posthumously called Xuanzong, the mysterious ancestor. He was 27 at his accession. He would rule for 44 years, until 756. The first 30 years of his reign, between roughly 712 and 742, are universally regarded as the High Golden Age of the Tang dynasty. This is the period that, in Chinese cultural memory, simply means the Tang. The empire was at its widest extent. The Silk Road was at its busiest. The capital Chang'an was at its most cosmopolitan. The economy was at its most productive. The civil service examinations were producing the most talented bureaucrats Chinese government had yet seen. The Buddhist translation projects were producing the deep philosophical texts on which East Asian Buddhism would rest for the next 1,000 years. And the poetry of this period is, perhaps, simply the most beautiful body of verse that any human civilization has ever produced. The greatest of the High Tang poets, Li Bai, Du Fu, Wang Wei, Meng Haoran, Bai Zhuyi, who lived a generation later, wrote about the things that High Tang civilization actually was. About moonlit nights in the imperial gardens. About wine, drunk on the Yangtze River, alone, with the moon as a companion. About frontier garrisons in the cold northwest. About Buddhist monasteries on misty mountainsides. About the sadness of a court official watching the moon rise over Chang'an, knowing his elderly mother is alone in the countryside far away. About the particular feeling of a farewell at a roadside pavilion, when a friend rides away into the dust and the pavilion bell rings once and the world is, suddenly, quieter than it should be. Tang poetry is, in its formal sophistication, at the same level as the highest moments of Greek tragedy or Persian Sufi verse, or English Renaissance lyric. It is, in its emotional range, broader. The Tang poets wrote about everything: love, war, nature, drinking, friendship, parting, death, the long sadness of being alive in a beautiful world that does not last. Their poems are still memorized today by literate Chinese-speaking children in Taiwan and Singapore and Beijing and San Francisco. They are part of the foundational vocabulary of East Asian civilization. We do not have time this evening to read very much of it, but here, briefly, is one short poem by Li Bai, written sometime in the 740s, while he was living in retirement on Lu Mountain, after being dismissed from the imperial court for various unspecified offenses. It is called Quiet Night Thought. It is 20 Chinese characters long, 4 lines of 5 characters each, the most basic form of classical Chinese lyric verse. In English it goes, more or less, like this. Before my bed, the moonlight is bright. I think perhaps it has been frosting on the ground. I lift my head, I look at the bright moon, I lower my head, I am thinking of home. That is 20 characters. Every Chinese literate person tonight can recite it from memory. It has been recited, in unbroken transmission, for 1300 years. The High Tang ended almost exactly at its peak in the year 755, with the rebellion of a single general. His name was An Lushan. He was a man of mixed Sogdian and Turkic ancestry, born somewhere in Central Asia, who had risen through the Tang military system to command the three largest northern frontier garrisons. By the early 750s, he held authority over perhaps 200,000 professional soldiers, a substantial fraction of the entire Tang military. He had, throughout his career, been a particular favorite of the aging Emperor Xuanzong, and especially of the emperor's late-life favorite consort, the legendary beauty Yang Guifei. The court intrigues among Yang Guifei's relatives and various other factions were, by the early 750s, extraordinarily complicated. An Lushan, increasingly powerful, increasingly suspicious that he would be purged in some future court reshuffle, decided to strike first. He marched south, with most of his army, in the late autumn of 755. The Tang central government, which had let its central armies decay during the long peace of the early 8th century, had almost no force capable of stopping him. An Lushan took the eastern capital of Luoyang in early 756. He proclaimed himself emperor of a new dynasty that he called Yan. He marched west, toward the imperial capital at Chang'an. The aging Emperor Xuanzong, accompanied by Yang Guifei and a small bodyguard, fled west toward Sichuan. At a small post station called Mawei Slope, the bodyguard mutinied. They demanded the death of Yang Guifei's brother, the chief minister Yang Guozhong, whom they blamed for the rebellion. The emperor handed him over and the soldiers killed him on the spot. Then, still unsatisfied, the soldiers demanded the death of Yang Guifei herself. The emperor protested. The soldiers refused to march further until she was dead. Eventually, the emperor consented. Yang Guifei was strangled with a silken cord in a small Buddhist shrine at the edge of the post station. She was 38 years old. She had been, by every account that survives, one of the most beautiful women in Chinese history. The poet Bai Juyi would, 50 years later, write a long narrative poem about her death, The Song of Everlasting Sorrow, which is even tonight one of the most famous poems in the Chinese canon. The An Lushan Rebellion was eventually suppressed, after 8 years of warfare, in 763. An Lushan himself had been murdered by his own son in 757. The son had been murdered by another general in 759. The remaining rebel forces were finally defeated by Tang loyalist armies, supplemented by Uyghur Turk auxiliary cavalry, in 763. The Tang dynasty survived, but it survived as a much-changed entity. The casualties of the rebellion were enormous. By some modern estimates, perhaps 30 million people died, between direct combat, plague, famine, and the breakdown of the agricultural system. The cosmopolitan high culture of the early 8th century never quite recovered. The Tang central government, after 763, never reasserted full control over the regional military commanderies. The Silk Road trade contracted. The empire's western territories in Central Asia were lost permanently to the Tibetans. The era of Tang grandeur was, from this point forward, increasingly an exercise in nostalgia. The remaining 144 years of the Tang dynasty, from 763 to 907, are usually considered together as the late Tang. The dynasty continued. It produced further capable emperors. It produced further great poets. It refined its administrative institutions. But it never recovered the imperial vitality of the High Tang. The principal long-term problem was the same problem that had brought down the Han: the slow erosion of central authority by powerful regional military governors, the Jiedushi. By the late 9th century, many of the Jiedushi commanderies had become, in effect, hereditary regional kingdoms that paid lip service to the Tang court but governed independently. Tax revenue from these commanderies stopped reaching Chang'an. The imperial central army withered. The court itself became, increasingly, dominated by eunuch palace officials who controlled access to the emperor and routinely arranged the deposition of emperors they found inconvenient. A series of severe peasant rebellions in the late 9th century, most notably the Huangqiao Rebellion of 874 to 884, which sacked both Luoyang and Chang'an, and killed, by some accounts, the bulk of Chang'an's foreign merchant community, broke what was left of the dynasty's military capacity. By the early years of the 10th century, the Tang emperor was a powerless figure, whose role was confined entirely to issuing decrees that ratified the decisions of the most powerful regional commander of the moment. The end came in 907. A regional commander named Zhu Wen, who had effectively controlled the imperial court for several years, finally deposed the last Tang emperor, a 13-year-old boy named Li Zhu, and proclaimed his own dynasty, which he called Liang. The Tang dynasty, after 289 years, was over. What followed, between 907 and 960, was a period of fragmentation that we now call the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms. 5 short-lived dynasties succeeded one another in the north, each lasting a few years before being overthrown by the next. 10 regional kingdoms of varying durability ruled the southern half of the old Tang territory. The unified empire was, again, broken. It would be reunified in 960 by a new dynasty called the Song, but the Song is the subject of another evening's story. We will tonight leave the Chinese imperial story at the end of the Tang, in 907, with the boy emperor deposed, the great cosmopolitan capital of Chang'an in ruins, and the long Tang afternoon finally ended. But the Tang did not, when it ended, simply disappear. Its long shadow extended forward, through every subsequent Chinese dynasty, and outward, across the entire Eastern Asian world. The civil service examination system, which the Sui had founded and the Tang had refined, would become the central institution of every later Chinese dynasty. The system was abolished only in 1905, in the dying years of the Qing dynasty. From its institutional beginning under the Sui, to its formal abolition in the early 20th century, the Chinese examination system functioned, essentially continuously, for over 1,300 years. Through that entire period, it served as the principal mechanism by which the Chinese state recruited its government officials. It shaped, more than any other institution, the intellectual culture of literate East Asia. The legal code of the Tang Code of 624 after Christ, refined repeatedly throughout the 7th century, became the foundational text of East Asian law. It was adopted, with relatively minor modifications, as the basis of the legal systems of Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. The conceptual structure of medieval and early modern East Asian law, including its distinctive categorization of crimes by their effect on family hierarchy, derives from the Tang Code. Many of its specific provisions can still be traced in the modern legal codes of East Asian states. The administrative geography of China itself, the system of provinces and prefectures and counties, was given its essential form by the Tang. The names of many of these subdivisions have changed over time, but the basic structure has persisted, with modifications, into the modern People's Republic. The Buddhist translation projects of the Tang, Xuanzongs, and many others, produced a Chinese Buddhist canon that became the textual foundation of all subsequent East Asian Buddhism. The Buddhist sects that emerged in this period, Pure Land Buddhism, Chan Buddhism, which would in Japan become Zen, Tiantai Buddhism, would in their varied descendant traditions dominate the religious life of East Asia for the next 1,000 years. The poetic forms of the Tang, the Jueju, the Lushi, the Gufeng, would remain until the literary modernization of the early 20th century, the dominant forms of Chinese classical verse. Every literate Chinese person, until about 100 years ago, could compose poetry in the Tang forms. The greatest Tang poets, Li Bai, Du Fu, Wang Wei, would be memorized, recited, and emulated, generation after generation, for the next 1,300 years. And the political idea of a unified Chinese empire, which the Sui had reasserted and the Tang had refined and stabilized, would, after every subsequent period of disunion, the 5 dynasties, the late Yuan, the late Qing, be reasserted again. The political default of the Chinese cultural area, after the Sui-Tang reunification, became a single empire. Disunion was an aberration. Reunification was a reversion to the proper order. Every subsequent rebel commander who succeeded in unifying the Chinese cultural area, the Song founder, the Yuan founder Kublai, the Ming founder Zhu Yuanzhang, the Qing founders, the founders of the Republic of China, the founders of the People's Republic of China, was, in some essential way, performing the role that had been first defined by the first emperor, and then re-established by the Sui and Tang. The Tang also left to the wider world a series of specific technological and cultural innovations that would, in their long propagation across Eurasia, change the shape of human civilization. The first was paper. Paper had been invented in China during the Han dynasty, traditionally credited to a court eunuch named Kai Lun, in 105 after Christ, although the actual invention probably predated him. By the Tang period, paper was the standard writing surface across the Chinese Empire, replacing earlier media such as silk, bamboo strips, and wooden tablets. Paper traveled west along the Silk Road. It reached the Islamic world after the Battle of Talas in 751, when Chinese papermakers captured by Arab forces were brought to Samarkand and Baghdad, where they established paper mills. From the Islamic world, papermaking spread to Sicily, then to Spain, then to the rest of Europe, where it arrived in significant quantities in the late 12th and 13th centuries. Paper, more than any other single material, made the late medieval European intellectual revolution possible. The European book, the European bureaucratic state, the European university, the early modern scientific revolution. All of these depended on the cheap, abundant, durable writing surface that the Tang Chinese had perfected. The second was woodblock printing. The earliest known printed book, the Diamond Sutra, dated by its colophon to the 11th of May, 868 after Christ, is a Tang Chinese document found by the British-Hungarian explorer Aurel Stein in 1907 in a sealed cave at Dunhuang on the Silk Road. It is, in 26.5 feet of printed scroll, the oldest dated printed book in the world. Movable type printing was developed later, in 11th century China under the Song dynasty, but woodblock printing, well established by the late Tang, was already producing books, calendars, religious texts, and commercial documents in significant numbers throughout China. The third was gunpowder. The earliest known formula for gunpowder appears in a 9th century Tang Taoist alchemical text, in a passage that warns adepts against accidentally igniting the formula because of its tendency to burst into flame and singe the hands and beard. The early Chinese applications of gunpowder were primarily in fireworks, in religious ceremonies, and in incendiary devices. The development of gunpowder into a serious military technology, the explosive grenade, the rocket, the cannon, would happen in later dynasties, primarily under the Song, but the foundational chemistry was Tang. The fourth was the magnetic compass. The directional properties of lodestone had been known in China since the Han period. By the Tang and early Song periods, magnetic compasses were being used systematically for divination, for siting buildings according to feng shui principles, and, by the late Song, for ocean navigation. Like paper and gunpowder, the compass would eventually travel west along the Silk Road, reaching the Islamic world by the late 11th century, and Europe by the 12th. These four innovations, paper, printing, gunpowder, the compass, were called by the British scientific historian Joseph Needham, in his enormous 20th century study of the history of Chinese science, the four great inventions. They are, by Needham's argument, the four most consequential technological transmissions from China to the wider Eurasian world. They are not the only ones. The Chinese also gave the world the rudder, the iron plow, the silk loom, the wheelbarrow, the suspension bridge, the iron chain suspension cable, paper money, the mechanical clock, in some debated sense the seismograph, and many other things. But the four great inventions are, in their cumulative effect on the shape of human civilization, perhaps the most important. The world we live in tonight, the world of printed books and gunpowder weapons, and magnetic compass-derived navigational instruments, is, in its deep technological foundations, a partial inheritance from the Tang dynasty. We have come to the end of our story. It has been a long walk, even by the standards of these long evenings. We began this evening in 210 before the birth of Christ, with the body of the first emperor making its slow journey home through the late summer heat of central China, accompanied by carts of rotting fish to disguise the smell. We have followed since then the rise of the Han dynasty out of the Qin's brief collapse, the 4th-century elaboration of Imperial Chinese institutions, the Long Disunion, the Sui reunification and its rapid implosion, the Tang founding, the An Lushan Rebellion, the slow Tang Twilight, and the cultural inheritance the Tang left behind for every subsequent age of East Asian civilization. It is, by simple span, a story of 1,117 years. It is also, by another reckoning, a story that has not really ended. The political project of unified Chinese empire, that the first emperor founded in 221 before Christ, and that the Sui Tang reunification, re-established in 589 after Christ, has continued, through many transformations, into our own time. The China of tonight is the direct linear descendant of the China of Han Wudi, of Tang Taizong, of Tang Xuanzong. The script its citizens write is the descendant of the Han script. Their language is the descendant of the Han language. Their cuisine, their architecture, their music, their philosophy, all carry forward identifiable elements that can be traced to the dynasties we have walked through tonight. The cosmopolitan capital of Chang'an, where Persian merchants drank in foreign taverns, and Japanese students studied Tang law and Sogdian musicians played strange instruments to dancing girls, is gone. Modern Xi'an stands on its site, but it is a smaller city, with a different shape, on different streets. The great rectangular grid of Tang Chang'an is buried under 1,500 years of subsequent construction. The old palace foundations have been excavated. A few of the original imperial buildings, especially in the suburbs, have been partially restored. But the city, as a living entity, is gone. What remains is the poetry. The Tang poetry survived. It is still being read tonight. In a small apartment in Beijing, in a literature class in Tokyo, in a Chinese-American family kitchen in San Francisco, in a high school classroom in Hanoi, somewhere on this planet at this very moment, someone is reciting a Tang poem, the 20 characters of Li Bai's Quiet Night Thought. The cold mountain landscape of Wang Wei, the sad, slow, devastating frontier verses of Du Fu. They are still being read. They have been read, in unbroken transmission for 13 centuries. That, perhaps, is the deepest legacy of the Tang. Not the institutions, although those have lasted. Not the technologies, although those changed the world. But the simple fact that, On a quiet night somewhere in the 8th century, a tired man sat up in bed, looked at the moonlight on the floor, and wrote 4 lines about missing his home, and that the 4 lines, by some small miracle of cultural continuity, are still being read and remembered and felt by people whose mother tongue would have been incomprehensible to him, in places he had never heard of, on a calendar he could not have imagined. The poet is gone, the empire is gone, the capital is gone, the poem remains. We are at the end now. Take a moment, if you are still awake, to soften your shoulders, to unclench your jaw, to let the day again go. If you are not still awake, that, perhaps, is the better outcome. We did not promise you a history, we promised you a sleep. The history was simply the carriage in which the sleep arrived. In a moment, this will end. There will be silence, the music will fade. Then, in another moment, this will begin again, for the next listener, somewhere else, in another quiet evening. The history, like the bright moon over Chang'an, does not end. It only continues, in some other room. We are very glad you came. We are very glad you stayed. We hope you sleep deeply and well. Good night, from the Drowsy Historian.